Well, welcome everyone. My name is Amy Leno, and I'm the Individualized Learning and Belonging Lead at the International School of Helsinki. And I'm also an honored member of ECIS Special Interest Group for Inclusive Education. And it's such an honor today to welcome and introduce Susan Shapiro, who will be leading us today in a session called Designing for Access and Agency, an Introduction to Universal Design for Learning. And in a moment, my partner, Eleni, will share a little bit more about our special interest group. But first, just to introduce Susan, that she is an implementation specialist working for CAST and really focusing on implementing universal design for learning. Before coming to CAST, she was on the faculty at Plymouth State University, where she designed and coordinated a graduate teacher certification program, taught graduate and undergraduate courses about inclusive elementary education. And for over 25 years, she has consulted in-service educators on issues related to inclusive learning design. And we're super excited for her to share with us today and learn together about the framework that directs attention for learning for all students, especially thinking about students who need access to educational materials and this belief that the barriers that exist for students live in the design and not within the students. So we're super, super happy to have you here today, Susan. So Eleni, I'll let you kind of take a little bit of the lead on our special interest group.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome, Susan. Thank you to Joe at the ECIS for making this happen, and thank you to all of you who are connecting today. This is the Inclusive Education Special Interest Group on ECIS, and we are very happy to host webinars every month on several themes, different every time. And this time is something that is dearly close to our hearts, UDL. We are hearing a lot about this as teachers and practitioners, and we are exploring it. And in this journey, we have Susan to help us with the UDL as an introductory meeting, introductory presentation and discussion. So please ask your questions. You can put any questions you have in the chat. This has been recorded, so you can watch it later on as a second time and for deep learning. Three reminders for the last three things, not to take your time, Susan. Please, if you want to share something, make sure that we uphold confidentiality. If you want to share a case of a student, avoid mentioning the name and the school, because the international community is indeed a small community. So we do want to protect our students' personal information. And the second thing, please mute yourselves as you've done already, so we don't have any background noise. Susan, is all of you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's really great to be here, and I'll tell you a story in a moment about my own teaching internship, and it happened to be at an international school. So I'll tell you that story in a minute. Let's just do a little bit of setup, and thank you for inviting me. If you're watching this as a recording, welcome to you as well. I know I often register for webinars, and then I watch them while I'm chopping vegetables to make soup or taking a walk or something. So I will try to adhere to the practice of accessibility that makes sure that the images that I'm going to show you on the screen are only supports to the learning. So hopefully you can listen to this without the slides, and it will make just as much sense. We know that from the accessibility world, that those with visual impairments or who may be blind, we need to make sure that we're not saying in a slide, as you can see, right? So I'll try to model accessibility as we go, and call me out where I forget to do so. So you have access, and my new colleagues at ECIS are going to put this in the chat for you, and I'm sure we'll share it with you, for those of you watching a webinar, to a Google document that I've just titled a resource doc here. There's a QR code that you can use, or you can type a bit.ly shortened URL into your browser, and it's bit.ly/UDLECIS. And that's all capitalized, and the bit.ly address is our case sensitive. What are you going to find there? You're going to find a link to the slides if you like to follow along with the slides during a webinar. And also, there are so many resources embedded in the slides, lots of videos and things. You're also going to find lots of resources that are not in the slides that you can use to direct your learning, excuse me, over the summer or into next year. We make a promise at CAST around accessibility. We know it's important. And so you're going to notice that I tried to model that today. We have simple backgrounds on the slides with high contrast text. I'm being metacognitive about this because it's an important piece of this work of universal design for learning. One of my former colleagues said, Mindy Johnson, you can have accessibility without UDL, but you can't have UDL without accessibility. Captions are enabled in Zoom, so you can turn those on. And when I show you a video clip, I'll make sure there are captions there. You have access to digital materials, so you can use translation technology. You can customize the digital font size or color contrast. We're using QR codes and hyperlinks and shortened links so that you don't have these long addresses or somebody using a screen reader isn't hearing 54502. There's alt text behind every image in the slide deck. And then Google Doc, that is the resource sheet, is nested. And I'm going to give you a tip sheet for how to do some of the things I just mentioned if there are things that you don't know how to do yet. And those are fun things to just kind of build in. If there's a barrier that you're experiencing, please feel free to private message Eleni or Amy to say, hey, and they'll talk to me, or feel free to tell me directly that I can't hear you or this isn't working for me. And we will redesign right on the spot. And that's the commitment, to make sure that everybody has access and everybody has agency. I know it's June. I used to be a public school teacher. I know what the fatigue level in June looks like. So I want to just summarize everything in one slide and say to you that this is UDL. I was going on and on and on one time with a colleague many, many years ago, Michael McSheehan, and he just put his hand up and he said, okay, stop. I get it. I get it. I get it. You're just saying that UDL is, instead of asking if the learner is ready for the lesson, UDL is asking if the lesson is ready for the learner. And that's exactly true. UDL says not, does the student have the capacity to learn from this lesson? Does this lesson have the capacity to help the student learn, right? Is it designed flexibly, accessibly, inclusively? The goals for this webinar are for you to understand 4 big ideas, and the webinar is organized in those big ideas so that you are able to continue your own professional learning about UDL, perhaps as a support for inclusive education. Maybe you'll do that alone, maybe you'll do that with colleagues, maybe you'll join the special interest group, maybe in your other special interest group. But I hope that by the end of this hour, and I'm going to kind of talk fast because I know most of you are seeing this as a recording, so you'll be able to change the speed. To understand that learning variability is not a new word for disability. Learning variability comes from the field of neuroscience, and it's the norm. Every single brain is as unique as every single human fingerprint, and kids with disabilities don't have more variability than other people. All brains are variable in how they use those core functions. We also know learning variability is contextual. I'm not the same learner everywhere I go. We'll talk more about all of this. And we know that we can anticipate variability. We don't have to wait until we meet our class, so to speak, to begin to design flexibly in our units and lessons. Also, as Amy said, barriers are in designs, not students. If there's anything to hold on to or write down, to me, that's the place to return. Like, it's such a call to action. The barrier is not the parent. The barrier is not the student. The barrier is not the teacher if you're an administrator, right? The barrier is in the design. Accessibility means that each and every student has access to the goals, the methods, the materials, the assessments, and the environments of learning. And for students with disabilities, there's a more finely grained definition of accessibility that we'll look at, but we're talking about accessibility generally as well. You know, can I access this content as a learner? We'll talk also about learner agency. That's the power that students walk in with, not the power we give them later when they graduate, but the power that is inherently theirs as human beings, right? And how do we give them opportunities to build that sense of being a learner, that good decision-making as a learner? I know for me, it's better when I listen to the story at the same time when I'm looking at the story. I know for me, it helps me when I have a graphic organizer for taking notes, right? How do we give kids opportunities to really be directing their own learning, to make learning plans, to set goals? And then what you see linked here is just the same resource sheet. So I'm hoping that you're able to learn these concepts so that when you jump into that resource, those resources, you have some background knowledge to help you navigate. I also want to say, for those that are administrators or school leaders in any way, getting teachers to use UDL is not the goal, right? UDL is a tool that helps teachers to design for access and agency. We want every learner to access the goal and the learning, and every learner to have agency in that learning experience, and the guidelines help us do that. I'm hoping today, as you think a little bit, you'll think, you know, this stuff that I do that is really wonderful aligns to these guidelines in this way. I do design multiple ways for learners to engage, but I don't really think about accessibility of my class materials. Maybe that's the thing I want to pay attention to. So not a checklist of do all this stuff, but an opportunity to say, what are you already paying attention to in your designs, and what might you want to pay attention to so that you can reach learners that you're not reaching today? And we all have learners that we're not reaching today. So I'm going to pause for just a moment here and ask you just to reflect. What do you already know about UDL? What did I describe in those concepts that you said, yeah, I already know that? What have you learned most recently about UDL? And what do you want to learn next about UDL? And maybe just make a mental or written note for yourself. Again, I'll just pause for a moment. You're welcome to use the chat at any time. And Eleni and Amy know they're welcome to interrupt me at any time to call anything out from the chat that needs to be called out. Okay, the agenda, I'm going to tell you a quick story from the International School of Brussels, where I just happened to be, just a coincidence that was my earliest experience as a teacher. We're going to talk about those big ideas a little bit longer: learning variability, barriers, accessibility, and learner agency. And we'll close with some questions and answers. All right, so it was 1986, and I was a college student. I was ready to do my student teaching. I was one of those students that was going to get special education endorsement as well as elementary education endorsement. I went and worked with a fabulous third grade teacher at the International School of Brussels. But one day, the principal of the school, the headmaster of the school of International School, ISB, came down and said, "Hey, I know that you're somebody who has special education background, and we have a student in our high school named Tina, and she has cerebral palsy, and we mainstream her into the general education art class once a week. And the paraprofessional who supports her in that classroom is out today. Would you be willing to fill in?" And if you're younger and you're listening to this and hearing that term mainstreaming was this practice that we used to use where we it almost was like we had a crystal ball or something, and we said, I think that, you know, Tina can get something out of art class, so she can leave the special education classroom and go to the general ed art class. I don't think Tina can get something out of art class, so out of biology class, right? So Tina stayed in that special ed classroom and did not get biology. So I said, sure. And I walked into the art class and I met Tina, and she seemed to have cerebral palsy. And I said some things like, hi, and how are you? And she didn't talk to me, and she didn't really acknowledge me in any way. She just kind of moved around the classroom. I saw what the class was doing. They had a full-page magazine ad with one side torn off, and they had to use colored pencils to color in the other side to make it seem like it wasn't missing. The goal was to improve the capacity for students to notice light and shadow in artistic works. My special ed hat, unfortunately, was on in that moment, and I thought, seeing Tina move around the room, I thought, she doesn't have the fine motor skills to do that, right? She's not going to be able to do that. So I thought, I've got to change this. I got some really big chart paper, the kind that we use in the early grades to, write out poems and stories. And I got some really thick crayons for her to hold. And I said, why don't you color? I did one thing right this day. Most of what I did was wrong. And I moved away, right? I kind of supported out of need, not out of habit. I let Tina navigate with the crayons and the paper while everybody else was doing the pencil drawing. When I came back, I noticed she had made some marks on the page. I also noticed that I had like 40 minutes left in the period and I didn't know what to do. So I wanted to give her a challenge. And so I dropped what I hope is the lowest high expectation, with air quotes there, high expectation, that I will ever suggest to any learner about anything. And I said, I love all the colors on the page. Why don't you make a rainbow? And when I walked away and then came back, this is what I saw on the page. This is her handwriting, and it says, I am bored. With bored spelled correctly, everything spelled correctly, capitalized, punctuated, the most important word in the sentence, bored, underlined a lot. I am bored. I presumed that the barrier was in Tina, that she can't and she wouldn't and she didn't and she wouldn't be able to do this activity. She wouldn't be able to get to this goal, right? But the barrier was not Tina. The barrier was in the design. So the first thing I did was apologize. And the second thing I did was I said, can I have your paper? Because I want to teach this story to people for the rest of my life, because it taught me and it always reminds me that we have got to presume competence for learners who don't rely fully on speech, for learners who may have dyslexia. We've got to presume we can't with competence. We can't wait for learners to come to us and say, here's all my testing that shows I can handle chapter books, right? We've got to presume competence. Ann Donlin and Martha Leary wrote a number of things, but this is from Ann Donlin's work on the criterion of the least dangerous assumption. She says, when in the absence of valid and reliable data, make the assumption that if proven wrong, will do the least amount of harm. I made a really dangerous assumption in that moment. Tina can't, right? The least dangerous assumption would be, I need to figure out how Tina can. High expectations for learners with disabilities. I'm going to show you a lot of things. I'm not going to play this video. Mostly I'm just going to show you things throughout this slide deck. But I want to highlight these because these are two examples from our TIES project. Cass was a partner on that project, where students with complex support needs are having access to really high level academic learning, like learning about the food web. This next one, students are learning about Newton's law. So they're there for your reference. And I love what this teacher says here when she's asked about this student with Down syndrome learning about Newton's law. For me, the most essential thing was thinking about the motion essential element. And if you know Newton's law, that's a science comment, right? It wasn't anything to do with like disability or special ed or good attitude. It was like the most important thing was starting with this piece of the academic learning. All right, are you familiar with Shelley Moore's work? Anybody? Okay, for those of you not familiar, she has some wonderful 5-minute videos. They're short, she's funny, engaging, and this one is one of her first ones, and it's called Transforming Inclusive Education. And you're gonna hear her, it's about 2 or 3 minutes long. You're gonna hear her talking about how she interviewed a bowler at a bowling alley, right, to learn a little bit about how they got all the pins down. And then she makes an analogy to universal design for learning.
Hi, my name is Shelley Moore, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregates students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be, philosophically, versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I gonna explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we could have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball was the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach to the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to, the kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal design for learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
All right, I'm going to keep moving along because we only have a little bit of time together, but I love that for a staff meeting, right? For a PLC, Shelley Moore has just been fantastic. All right, learning variability. One of the ways I know I need to think about accessibility around cognition is to always summarize what I'm about to say so people have access to that before I explain it. So again, learning variability is the norm, contextual, and can be anticipated in learning designs. I'm going to show you this definition of UDL about 4 times, and each time a different part will be emphasized, and that's the part we're going to dig into. And hopefully by the last time you see this definition, you're going to say, I know what all those words mean, right? And I understand all those concepts. So universal design for learning is an educational framework based on research in the learning sciences that guides the development of flexible and accessible methods, materials, and environments that anticipate learning variability, minimize barriers in design, and honor and build learner agency. Todd Rose used to work at CAST, and this is a TED Talk that he does where he talks about the Air Force, and they had this problem and they weren't getting the results they wanted. So they figured out after lots of theories that it was the design of the cockpit. And the cockpit was designed for the average pilot, but they took measurements of like 1 billion pilots and nobody was average, right? So they learned they need to make the cockpit customizable for arm length and height and size and all of that. That's a wonderful TED Talk if you want to take a look. He then kind of, in his talk, he shares an image of a classroom with desks all in rows and just kind of facing forward, all the same size, and thinking about not only are the seats the same size, but the curriculum is the same. And the way that we ask learners to engage in the curriculum is the same. And the assessment is the same. And the way that we ask students to interact with each other is the same. So we sort of design for average. If you want to watch Shelley Moore again, she does the same kind of talk that Todd does, but in about 5 minutes, because that's her theme, is 5 minutes or less. And she says, you know, the error is the assumption that the curriculum is static. So both of those are about the book that Todd wrote called The End of Average. 3 big pieces around learning variability that I hope you kind of have anchored today so that when you dive into materials, they're there with these anchors are solid for you. Learning variability is not about, it's about, I'll just say, it's about what we understand from the cognitive learning sciences about how human brains learn. When I was a teacher, early back in 1986, you know, we didn't have fMRI scans of the brain that we have today. We didn't know as much about how people use those brain functions. The image on the screen is a very simplified image to almost like an icon to represent 3 core functions of the brain. But if you really had a brain MRI, your brain wouldn't have a purple, blue, and green section this simplified. But for the sake of learning, our founder, David Rose, who is a neuroscientist, developed this model to remind us that the brain has at the far back these recognition networks that really answer the question about what in learning. What is this that I'm looking at, right? What do I already know about it? What background knowledge can I bring to it? What does this word mean? What is this symbol? At the front of the brain, we have strategic networks that really direct the how of learning. How am I going to engage? How am I going to even find energy and interest in doing this? How am I going to self-regulate and manage my feelings while I'm learning? And then in the center, I'm sorry, that's in this, and I mean, the strategic networks, I apologize, I'm going to start that part over again. I wish it really was a video I could just stop record. The strategic networks are the networks that direct the how of learning. How am I going to physically navigate in this learning experience? How am I going to express and communicate my thinking and understanding? How am I going to demonstrate my learning? How am I going to manage and plan my learning, use those executive functions? And then in the center of the brain, we have those affective networks. And those are the networks that really guide the engaging in learning. The why. Why am I even going to do this at all? Am I even safe here? How am I going to recruit my own interest? How am I going to stay and sustain my effort? How am I going to manage my feelings and emotions while I'm learning? We all vary in how we use those functions of the brain, and that variability is the norm. We don't have, some students and then these outliers. Every single brain is unique. To me, that's a really big mindset shift in the Universal Design for Learning framework. There's an article that summarizes what I just said about UDL and the learning brain and flushes it out a little bit. If you're interested, it's linked here in the slides. We also know that in addition to being the norm, learning variability is contextual. And here's a silly story about myself to make this point. On the left, you see an old picture of me at a meeting. And when I'm at a meeting, I don't take too many notes. I find listening in a meeting to be a great way for me to learn new ideas and concepts. Well, based on that, you might think maybe she's an auditory learner, because that's what we used to think back, a long time ago, that there were these learning styles that learners had. And it was what we knew at the time, but we know today there's no such thing as a learning style, right? And then the picture on the right, I'm wearing fly fishing gear, and it's a long time ago also. And my boyfriend was trying to teach me how to fly fish by telling me about it, right? Just talking and talking and talking. And I couldn't learn, right? So I wasn't an auditory input for me in that moment was really challenging. In fact, it was creating anxiety in me. What I needed in that moment was for somebody who was watching to come over and grab my arm and show me how to use the fly fishing rod to try to catch the fish. So there's an article linked here called The Myth of Learning Styles. I used to do learning style inventories with kids with disabilities when I was first teaching, because that is what we knew. But as somebody said, when you know better, you do better. So today we know from science that variability is contextual. We are different learners from each other, but we're also different learners within ourselves, depending on the context. We also have learned, and we're paying more attention to now, thankfully, this idea that emotion is part of the context. So if I go back and think about myself in that meeting, I might be not taking notes and listening and feeling like that's a great way for me to get information. But if I look down and see a text message that says your mom's going to the hospital, right? That's part of my context now too, that feeling state. So emotion and cognition, we know, are inextricably linked. And this is a beautiful, if you're going to watch anything this summer, I would encourage you to watch this 7-minute clip of Mary Helen Immordino Yang talking about the fact that we cannot learn anything about which we are not feeling emotionally engaged with. It's a wonderful piece, and she is a neuroscientist. The third piece around learning variability that I want to share with you is that we can anticipate and design for the variability in learning before we know the individual learners. It's not to say we don't want to know our students well and know that they love baseball or cooking, but that we can anticipate the variability in learning. And I'm going to use a food example just to kind of ground that for a moment in life, and then I'll bring that to the classroom. The UDL guidelines are what we use to help us do that designing, and we'll talk about how to use those more as we go. All right, so this is an example at a staff meeting, and then I'm going to use an example in a classroom. So let's just say we were all in person, and I had this goal that I was coming to your school, and I wanted to provide snacks for the meeting that we were having with me coming to talk about UDL. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll get a lot of jelly donuts. Everybody loves jelly donuts, and I get up early and I make a special trip to the donut shop and I get these donuts. It's likely, if I said, everybody let me know, would you have one? It's likely that many of you wouldn't have a jelly donut for some reason, right? Maybe you're gluten-free. Maybe that's a choice. Maybe that's a medical condition. Maybe you love donuts, but you just don't really like jelly. Maybe you're just avoiding sugar as a temporary situation or forever. Maybe you just are kind of anxious eating in public. If I said you can take one with you and bring it home, you might take it. Or maybe you're like, yeah, that sounds great. I'll have a couple. I love jelly donuts. if I came back and I said to, you know, my colleague, didn't go that well when I went to Europe because I brought donuts and not everybody liked them. They were like, why did you think everybody would want a donut? Like, you know that there are vegetarians, you know that there are people who don't eat gluten, you know that there's variability in diet, right? You should have been able to anticipate and design for that variability in diet. So how would I have done that? Do I have to bring a special snack to each of you? Like, Amy, what do you want? Do you want sushi? Okay, great. Eleni, what do you want? You want chips and salsa, right? That's too much work. And I call this out because teachers sometimes worry, right, that UDL is about this, right? UDL is every single student has an individual plan for every single lesson for every single day. No, it's not that. Individualized work is fantastic, all good, but universal design for learning is more like a sandwich bar, right? Saying I still have the same goal. I want to provide teachers with a snack at the meeting, but I'm going to do it in a way that I hope gives more people access to the goal, getting a snack, and agency as a person in the meeting, right? Agency to make their own sandwich. Maybe I'm going to just wrap up tomatoes and lettuce leaves. Maybe I'm going to put on hummus or use gluten-free bread. Maybe I'm going to make a big stacked meat sandwich. Maybe I'm going to make a big one. Maybe I'm going to make a small one. Maybe I'm going to make it to go. Maybe I'm going to eat it here, right? Any option that people want, hopefully can be met in this design. That's not to say that if somebody is following a medical milkshake diet for some tender condition in their body or for any reason, that that person can't be at the meeting, right? We would still say pull up a chair. But this menu, this design accommodates more people, right? So I don't want to leave any impression that if somebody can't eat off this sandwich bar, that they can't be at the meeting, right? Just that this sandwich bar is a better starting point, a better menu that will hopefully work for more people. All right, now we'll move to the classroom. So there's a poem here by Langston Hughes called Dream Deferred. I'm not going to read the whole poem. I'm just going to say that it's about, I don't know, 12 lines. Imagine that the teacher's goal is for students to be able to interpret the key messages, you know, sort of the theme of a poem. And so the teacher designs this. Students are going to independently read a paper copy of the poem, and then they're going to work with a small group to identify the poem's message. When I think about that with a UDL mindset, I ask myself, are there any barriers in that design? Now, I'm not asking, do I have any students with barriers? Because remember, we're thinking about barriers in designs, but I'm asking myself, are there any barriers? And I'm thinking, well, the lesson design kind of assumes that everybody can independently read off of a paper copy, right? It makes an assumption about prerequisite skills. Working with a small group to identify the poem's message is, for some students, that would be a great way for them to navigate this experience, but for others, that social anxiety could rise up and the social demands could really shut down learning. So that could be that it's kind of a one-size-fits-all lesson. I know that there's variability in my students, right? This teacher knows that there's variability, that some students read better using text-to-speech software. Some students are emerging bilingual learners learning English right now. Some students experience social anxiety and a host of other things, right? A host of other ways that students experience learning. So we could use the UDL guidelines. This is just a small sample to start us off. To think about making that design more flexible. Instead of saying, everybody do it this week, read this paper copy, 11-point font, black and white, not digital, and everybody talk in a small group and find the theme of the poem. We could give students choice, right? We could say you can either use a paper copy or a digital copy of the poem to read it. And then you can make a decision if you want to consider the key messages of the poem by joining a small group discussion, or you can hop into this shared Google Doc and you can write your ideas with other people who are also writing their ideas and have that written discussion in the document. Let me pause right there and just see if that makes sense to you before I talk about those guidelines. You just put in the chat like a 5-finger check. 5 is, I understand the difference between that first design that was kind of like everybody doing this, and that second design where there was a little bit more flexibility. There was choice for learners, options. 0 is, I don't understand at all what you just said. I think we need to go over that a little more slowly, or, 3 is somewhere in the middle. We just put something in the chat for me.
Susan, I also want to add that I really liked your story with the menu before, and your example with the menu, and really the idea of being able as teachers and practitioners to open our mind. And as we do for a menu at home tonight with friends, we should be transferring this to our classrooms. And I think it's important that it's, the importance of transfer of knowledge and mindset change as well. Thank you for that. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful example.
Great. Good. I'm glad. And I'm glad to see 5s in the chat as well. And anybody who's watching this webinar at any time, feel free to use these slides with your colleagues and with your, teachers, whatever your role might be, with families. So these are freely available. Great. Strong goals and flexible pathways. Absolutely. That's it, Amy. Clear goals, flexible means, right? We stay true to the goal. I didn't do that with Tina, and we designed lots of ways to get there. The UDL guidelines are on the screen, and 2 of them are circled. One says provide options for perception. The other one says provide options for expression and communication. I just thought that those 2 were kind of the most aligned to this shift in this lesson design, right? The teacher said, not all students can perceive the paper copy text of the poem, so I need to provide another option for perception. And the teacher provided that digital version so students could have it read aloud, use translation technology, enlarge the font size, and so forth. The teacher also thought about options for expression and communication. Rather than saying you must get in a small group and talk to other students about the theme, there were options for how you communicated your ideas and your thinking about the poem's key message, right? You can go into that Google Doc, or you can have a small group discussion. I taught a graduate course this last semester at the University of New Hampshire. I would live in New Hampshire. And every single time we had a discussion, there was always a Google Doc, right? For those moments where students just were exhausted or just preferred to not have to figure out how to jump into the conversation. All right, so as you may or may not know, the UDL guidelines have been iterated on several times since their birth. They were first kind of born as UDL, I think 1.0, because we knew at CAST, and I wasn't at CAST at that time, but we knew at CAST that we would be changing them. And we know that today we're proposing a new set of guidelines, updated, I should say, guidelines 3.0. But we also know that we're going to say this again someday, right? We're going to be talking about 3.2 or 5.9. So I'm going to play this very short, maybe 4-minute clip of the 2 women who have led the work of updating the guidelines, just to give you a little bit of context for how they're changing. They're due to be released in their final version in July. We have a big conference, UDL Con. I encourage you to check that out as well. It's hybrid. You can come in person, or you can come, it's in California, or you can come online. But Nicole Tucker-Smith and Jenna Gravel will explain some of the big ideas and the feedback that we've gotten at CAST, the new research that we've learned about from the learning sciences, and why some of these changes have happened.
Introduction to the full summary of proposed updates for the UDL Guidelines 3.0. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Gravel.
And I am Nicole Tucker-Smith. And we are currently serving as co-chairs of UDL Rising to Equity, a community-driven process to update the UDL guidelines through an equity lens. The UDL guidelines are a living and dynamic tool, and this updating process is part of the continued evolution of the guidelines.
And we are so excited because after more than 3 years of conducting focus groups and working with our advisory board, Guidelines Collaborative, and Young Adult Board, we are sharing a full draft of the next iteration of the UDL Guidelines version 3.0 this spring for public comment.
Prior to the release of the full draft, we are offering a summary of the proposed update. We hope that this summary is helpful to ground the UDL community and practitioners in the overarching themes and the rationale behind proposed changes. So without further ado, let's get to it.
So several overarching themes have emerged from the focus group data and reviews of the research. One of the biggest themes is the need to recognize identity as part of variability and to more fully emphasize the role that identity plays in teaching and learning. Another overarching theme is to more fully emphasize the value of interdependence and collective learning.
Yes, and in addition, there is this overwhelming need to acknowledge individual, institutional, and systemic biases as barriers to learning without limits. And there is also a call to shift from teacher-centered to learner-centered language.
And strong themes have emerged for updates for each of the 3 UDL principles and the corresponding guidelines and checkpoints as well. There were clear calls for expanding multiple means of engagement to affirm learners' identities and lived experiences, to incorporate the role of belonging, and to emphasize the role of joy and play in teaching and learning.
And it is evident that we need to expand multiple means of representation to consider perceptions of people, culture, and intersecting identities. There's also the need to value multiple ways of knowing beyond Western approaches to knowledge.
Yes. And in terms of multiple means of action and expression, there is a clear call to center and value forms of expression that have been historically silenced or ignored, and to address the role that bias plays in offering modes of expression.
We've also identified some concerns around the concept of expert learning. The word expert implies ideas of exclusivity and elitism, and it can fail to recognize the brilliance inherent in every learner.
So we have created this summary document to highlight overarching updates and to share the why behind those updates. We've included quotes from focus groups to center practitioners and other community members' perspectives, and we've also included examples of research that have inspired the changes.
We'd love for you to consider sharing your thoughts via the survey embedded in the summary document. Since our launch in 2020, we have been committed to a community-driven, inclusive, and transparent updating process, and we are eager to learn from your feedback. These past few years have been quite a journey, fueled by the hope that the UDL Guidelines 3.0 update will bring us closer to fulfilling the promise of learning without limits.
Find the full summary of proposed updates at bit.ly/UDL3-summary. Share your thoughts.
And the survey for your comments is closed now, but we've gotten comments from so many people across the globe. But you do have, that bit.ly is still live, but also everything's linked in the resource document as well. So don't worry about finding those things. I'm going to keep
I
moving.
can ask a question. Now that you mentioned the future of the proposed updates and guidelines, what is maybe it's a big question, and feel free not to answer or answer it later. What is the nature and your exploring your relationship as CAST with artificial intelligence?
Oh, such a wonderful
UDL and artificial intelligence. How they talk to each other for you, and how they might talk to each other later. Maybe it's a big question, but I just thought when you said, when you mentioned updated.
It's a big question, and CAST as an organization is right at the table of that conversation, really wanting to make sure, one, that we remind the world that artificial intelligence must be designed accessibly, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and two, that we can teach students, right, how to use AI to help them to support executive function, to help them figure out ways of navigating. Teachers use AI to create leveled reading versions of a text, right? So many wonderful, we get sort of thinking, I think, in the field and in the media, like, oh my gosh, students are cheating. Like, okay, let's just hold on. That there's so much opportunity here for AI to be, and somebody said, not knowing how to use AI as a learner is really going to be a barrier to being successful in this job market, right? So I think one of the quotes that taught me the most was, you're not going to be replaced, your job is not going to be replaced by AI. You're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI better than you, right? So yes, we are, but we're not sitting ahead of you on this conversation. We're sitting next to people saying like, we understand UDL and we're all trying to figure this out, and let's think a little bit about that. So thank you for asking. Yeah. It's 10:16. I was hoping to just, is it okay if I just go through quickly barriers and accessibility, or do you want me just to stop right here? I'll go, okay. All right, barriers can be mindsets, environments, educational materials, methods, assessments, and systems. The only thing that can't be, right, is students, people. UDL is a framework, and I'm going to jump ahead, that minimizes barriers in design, right? So how are we thinking about minimizing the barriers in the design? If my daughter's getting married and she says we're going to get married down by the water at 9 o'clock at night, I'm thinking already not everybody can get down to the water, right, across the sand by the ocean. So we need to build a ramp, right? My mom's not going to be able to do that with her walker, right? So I'm thinking about barriers, not barriers in my mom, but barriers in Chloe's design for her wedding. So barriers are in designs. You may have seen this analogy, but I want to just share it if you haven't. The goal in this image of people looking at a soccer game is for them to watch the soccer game carefully. I mean, safely. There's a big wooden fence. And so in a model of equality, we would have everybody get a box and they can stand on the box, each person, and look over the fence. And if you're taller, you're really seeing the game from a higher point of view. And if you're shorter, you still might be looking straight into the fence. The equality, everybody getting the same thing, does not give everybody access and agency. Equity is a much better goal, right? To say we're going to make sure that people get what they need. If you can see over the fence without the box, you don't need a box. And if you need 2 boxes, you get 2 boxes. And equity is a wonderful goal. This image does not at all infer that equity is not a great vision to go for. The fence is still wooden, the game is still going on. We're sort of helping people to have access and agency. What I love about UDL is that it says, can we even think about the barrier itself here? Like, could we just think about the fence and can we take it down? No, maybe not, because that wouldn't get us to the goal of safely watching the game. But could we reduce it in some way, make it a chain link fence, right? And you see that chain link fence there, and people can look through that fence to safely see the game. The boxes are still there and they're not given out by student characteristic or human characteristic. If you're short, take 2 boxes, medium height. They're just there for anybody to use. And that's the honoring agency part, to say, you know, maybe you're really tall, but also maybe you're really tired, right? And you want to sit on a box, right? So we're giving the person the choice in using those options. And that's universal design for learning. UDL came from the world of architecture. There are 2 school entrances imaged here. The first is older and it has steps to get into the door. There's a big blue door at the top of the stone steps and a little tiny sign next to the door that says disabled persons entrance at the rear of the building. The other school building entrance was designed proactively with variability in mind. Those architects knew that people vary in how they physically navigate space. And so there are steps and ramps and railings, and there's no sign, right? People come and they get to decide anytime, 5 times during the day, they can go in or out of that building in a different way, whatever makes sense for them in the moment. At some point, somebody said this building's not accessible. And at some point we stuck a ramp on the back, right? And we did what we kind of like to think of as retrofitting for access. Oh my gosh, we designed this building without you in mind. Here, we put a ramp on the back of the building. We don't really give you any opportunity for agency to make any choices. We're still saying, like, go to the back of the building. And I don't need to ask you, you know, how would this make you feel? Does this feel welcoming? Do you feel like you belong? Of course, those feelings are, yeah, not there. Universal design for learning comes from, Cass took that concept from the field of architecture and moved it to the classroom to say, what about options for access in the classroom too, right? Options for access into that school building, a ramp and stairs. What about options for access to the learning goal, right? In this image, there's a student looking at a text with earphones on, looking at a laptop computer. There's a student holding a paper book using a pair of glasses, and there's a student who's blind using a Braille version of the text, right? Options provide access for learners. UDL is a mindset shift, and I'm just going to read one of these, and then you'll know how to look at the others on your own. We might frame it this one way, and then I'm going to kind of reframe it to use the barrier in design thinking. So I might have said a long time ago, well, Micah doesn't really have the social skills to work with a partner on this assignment, right? I'm kind of waiting for Micah to get those social skills to work with a partner. But if I use this UDL lens, I might think about it differently and say, the instructions for the assignment, they don't really offer any protocols or suggestions to support student collaboration. It doesn't say like, here's a way for you and your partner to work together. So the instructions don't really design, right? They're not really accessible. They don't really design for access and agency. They're asking Micah to be different rather than the design itself changing. Chloe is not in a state of mind for learning when she gets to school. We could wait for Chloe to have a different life or be able to change her emotional makeup in a different way, but right, that's not super respectful. What if we think about the school schedule, right? And see the barrier in the school schedule doesn't really give kids time for self-regulation in the morning. The words that are bolded, instructions for the assignment, school schedule, project guidelines, course content, to me is really the good news of UDL because we made the stuff, right? We made the schedule and all the stuff in the curriculum, and we can change that. And in fact, I think we have an obligation to do so, right? So it's really where teachers can often feel empowered with UDL because I don't have to wait for Micah and Chloe and Elena and Mark to change. I can change my design. All right, accessibility means each and every student has access to the goals, methods, materials, and environments of learning. UDL is a framework that guides the development and the purchase of flexible and accessible methods, materials, and environments that anticipate learning variability, minimize barriers in design, and honor and build learner agency. One of our colleagues, Luis Perez, says he uses blueberry nut muffins as an analogy. And he says, when you're baking blueberry muffins, you can't add the blueberries at the end. It won't be a blueberry muffin. You can't put them in after you bake the muffin. You have to bake the blueberries right in the batter. And accessibility can't be added at the end. You can't design your unit on how rivers are formed and then think about accessibility afterward. Accessibility has to be built right into the original thinking about the unit. The definition of accessibility for a student with disabilities is on this slide, and I'm going to keep moving because of time, but it's there for you. I think we only have a few, a few minutes. I want to just show you one part of this video of Grant Blasco, a student who is autistic, who talks a little bit about his experiences at the beginning of this clip. I encourage you to watch this. It's fantastic. He's talking at an autism conference about his experiences being included in one state, moving across the country, the United States, and then being included there. And he really highlights the importance of accessible educational materials. You'll hear Grant in his presentation comment, I was welcomed into classrooms, but that doesn't mean they were designed for me or that a teacher was ready for me. So there's a lot in these slides. And if Eleni wants me to make another recording to go through the rest later or something, we'll do that. We'll figure that out. It's pretty self-explanatory as well, but you're always welcome to reach out to me directly too. I work all summer, but I'll just show you this piece from Grant because I want to end with his voice and then your voices and your questions. Pause here. I'm going to jump ahead, but the beginning is wonderful too.
Hard. That's what I want to share. That inclusion is about so much more than just a desire to include students. I'm fortunate to travel to conferences and spend time with professionals, so I am aware of what typical supports and strategies are used to include kids like me. What I did not realize was how much work needs to happen all over a system in order for a kid like me to walk into a classroom and feel successful every day. We have all heard what accommodations to ask for. The typical accommodations are listed on an IEP, and being eligible for them means that a school needs to provide them. My typical accommodations are things like access to digital print materials, a human reader, a scribe, extra time to complete assignments, and sensory breaks. However, having accommodations means that you are one student among many students with different requirements. I spend a lot of time thinking about how things can be better for students like me, but I also notice kids all around me who could use some of the accommodations I get. Years ago, I started learning about universal design for learning, and I am convinced that if schools were more focused on UDL, more kids like me could be included. I am going to let Michael explain all the technical details, but I'll share this. Really, almost every accommodation I need can be found in classrooms with great accessibility. So much of my daily stress comes from trying to jump through hoops every day to gain access. Even if there is a person assigned to help me, no one person can do it all. As schools have given us more access to technology, more sources of information for learning are present. My experience is that so many students who type are trying to gain access to classes by getting their communication recognized as valid. Once you gain access though, there is much that can be done to make the next part of the journey less stressful. Give the kids a break. So what do I mean by that? Prepare for a student to be in your class. Accommodations are necessary sometimes, but I think we should be planning for more variability of students in classrooms from the beginning. I am welcomed into classes, but that does not mean they were designed for me, or that a teacher is ready for me. Here's what might happen. A lesson might have objectives, activities, and assignments that never consider how I will do any of that work. The materials may not be digital, so that means I might not be able to increase the size, or use my text-to-speech accommodation. The worksheets may be on paper, or a scanned picture of a document, which means that someone will need to create the document especially for me. The activity may call for a small group discussion over just a couple of minutes. I am supposed to get questions ahead, but that doesn't happen every day, so I do the best I can. But it is stressful. In universal design, so many of these stressors would be removed. That's what I want to make sure I talk about. Powers who support students who type can move mountains, but the work should be distributed. When teachers don't really know all the ways I am running into barriers, then they can't improve at including more kids like me. My heart breaks when I walk into a class and realize nobody thought about how I would participate ahead of time, and when I am sad, I have a much harder time staying calm and attentive. The para with me will now have to scramble, and everyone sees all the effort, so I won't look competent to many people today. Yesterday's presentation by Dr. Lorenz and Dr. Fee resonated so much with me. I have been studying about the effects of stress on brains for the last couple years, and I need to say that my whole day is often managing my reactions to things like accessibility issues. I try to shake it off, but every occurrence of similar scenarios from other days flashes through my mind, and I struggle to keep my focus. Okay, then there's always the chance that a well-meaning teacher realizes I am not dysregulated, and thinks I totally don't need to do this activity after all, and excuses me from work. In some cases, this is fine because I can show my value in other ways, but teachers should know that this does not feel inclusive to me, and it's embarrassing and demotivating, and it makes me wonder why I ever got out of bed that morning. So, let me start to share my vision. Let's get better at UDL. Today we will go over a lot to think about, and I hope it leads to a great discussion.
Okay. And if you're somebody this summer who wants to learn about accessible educational materials, there's a tip sheet for 10 starting points for those materials that we developed at CAST, that may be a place to begin. I'm going to jump ahead, and we're not going to look at learner agency at all, but you can look through that. And I just have on the screen the goals. Again, learning variability, barriers, accessibility, learner agency, learners making decisions. What questions or connections or anything you want to add to this recording for your colleagues in international schools? The floor is yours, and I'm happy to stick around for a minute. I don't have another meeting right now.
Susan, thank you so much. Please put your questions in the chat, or you can send us individually your questions via email. Also check our page for the Inclusive Education Special Interest Group and the events we have, but also all the events in their entirety on the ECIS page. Wonderful. I mean, the videos you share, the stories, your personal stories with Tina were amazing, Susan. I need some time to reflect. There were absolutely so many ideas and so many feelings and emotions that I felt. Amy will probably agree with me,
Yes.
especially the fact that you mentioned that in order for learning to happen, the emotional aspect should be first satisfied, and that makes me feel that I need to design my lessons starting from this emotional aspect, if you will.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
clip
thank
from
you.
Mary Helen is amazing. Mary Helen and Mordino Yang, emotion in the, yeah, that's what we want to watch. Amy, happen.
Susan, the hour was just not enough.
Yeah.
Really, that was really inspiring and just so well paced with kind of stories and research and tools and strategies. I'm so excited to hear about UDL 3.0 and identity becoming a part of the work that we're doing. And I especially loved also the fences and boxes analogy, because we use that with our students, and I just kind of got a little goosebumpy thinking about bringing that back to the kids and giving a new lens. So thank you for all of this, and I know that this work will continue, and really appreciate you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting past. Anybody else?
Any questions you might have, we can ask now, Susan. I think we don't have any questions, Susan, but thank you so much. Thank you, Joe, and from Amy and myself, and thank you so much for all your wonderful presentation today and the concepts you have presented us.
Thank
Have a
you.
lovely evening.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you, everyone.
too. And reach out
Bye now.
anytime. We'd love to hear from you. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Joe, from ECIS. Thank you. Thank you, CIS.